Cartoon Network, a staple of my childhood along with channels like Nickelodeon, PBS Kids, Disney Channel. But let's be real, compared to those other ones, Cartoon Network was completely unhinged. Sure, they had a few normal shows here and there, but most of the time it felt like the executives were just like throwing fever dreams at the wall and seeing what stuck. And honestly, I loved every second of it. So today we're taking a trip back through the Cartoon Network lineup to find out which show was the strangest of them all. A couple quick stipulations. I'm only going to be ranking shows that I actually watched, so this isn't going to cover like every single Cartoon Network show. And I'm also only going to include shows that were actually Cartoon Network originals or aired first on the channel in the US. Also, won't be counting any of the DC shows just because I feel like that would add too much here. But I think we can all agree that Teen Titans Go gets pretty fucking weird sometimes. Outside of that, they're pretty normal for the most part. First up, we've got Dexter's Lab. Now, Dexter's Lab might feel a little weird at first, but it's actually fairly normal compared to a lot of these shows. The premise of having like a super genius kid is a little out there, but it's not like totally insane. Honestly, most of the weirdness of this show comes from the quirkiness of the characters themselves. Like, you've got Dexter's voice, Dee Dee's chaotic energy, Mandark's laugh. But the second that the show steps outside of the lab, it actually feels pretty grounded. It's an imaginative show for sure, with all of Dexter's inventions and whatnot, but it's not quite as strange as like the fever dream shows that we get eventually. So I think we're going to start off on a C tier. Johnny Bravo. Honestly, the weirdest thing about this show is the main character himself, Johnny. The world that he's in feels pretty normal for the most part, besides him. A wannabe Elvis impersonator who's constantly karate chopping everything, talking to animals, and just getting his ass handed to him by every lady that he harasses. It's slapsticky at times, but it's pretty much just a weird guy interacting with a normal world. There's some like parody moments and celebrity cameos, but generally it's a pretty tame show for the most part, at least when it comes to like weirdness. If anything, this just sort of feels like an animated sitcom with a very strange lead character. I think this is going to go on D tier. Cow and Chicken. Jumping up the weird scale here a little bit, we've got a show revolving around two siblings, a cow and a chicken, being raised by human parents. Already getting a little bizarre there, and then you throw in the main antagonist of the show, Red Guy. He's this like usually naked red devil character that just sort of shows up to cause chaos and trouble, and just brings this like weird chaotic energy every time that he shows up. The entire show has like a manic focus on butts and farts, which just makes it that much more unhinged. And while the show was indeed weird, loud, and gross at times, the stories and plotlines were usually pretty grounded and fairly normal, but it was still just a tad more bizarre than pretty much anything else airing at the time. I'm thinking Cow and Chicken's gonna go on B tier. I Am Weasel. Being a spin-off of the previous show Cow and Chicken, I Am Weasel shares a lot of the weird DNA. Same creator, same world, same gross out style, same weird ass red guy. The premise is actually a little bit more straightforward than Cow and Chicken, with most episodes revolving around Weasel being dragged into shenanigans by the obnoxious and incompetent IR Baboon. While Weasel's more of like the straight man, the show's chaotic nature tends to stem from Baboon mostly. The plots and the structure of the show could be a little bit out there at times, but it also almost always had like a clear setup and story to it. Compared to Cow and Chicken, it also relied more on like satire and parody than gross out humor. But even though it's played a bit more straight, I'd still put it right around the same level as weird as the last show, so we're gonna go B tier. Powerpuff Girls. Now on paper, this should be a really weird show. It's a group of kindergarten sisters who have superpowers and fight a rogues gallery of some of the weirdest villains you've ever seen. The whole thing's like super stylized too, which gives it a bit of a different vibe than some of the other shows. But when it comes down to it, it's a pretty standard superhero story. Almost every episode is like, villain shows up, city's in peril, Powerpuff Girls save the day, reset. And yeah, some of the villains are definitely a little weird. You've got like an evil rich girl, monster broccoli, a talking monkey, and you know, the fucking devil. But for the most part, they're pretty standardized villains with clear motives and not just like random nonsense. And I think the show does what it sets out to do pretty well. You know, it balances the tone between like cute and funny animated show and superhero story about fighting bad guys. The concept is definitely a little bit out there, but the execution of the show is really straightforward and fairly normal. I think this is going on C tier. Ed, Edd and Eddy. And here we've got pretty much the complete opposite. A show that should be fairly normal, just centering around a group of kids in a cul-de-sac, but the writing and the execution of this just really ups the ante of the weirdness. Even the animation style of this one just gets kind of weird and out there. The outlines of the characters and the objects become meaningless at times. All the characters are basically rubberized to the point that they're Looney Tunes. There's no adults, no rules, no laws of physics. It feels like just like a pocket dimension of weirdness. And pretty much every character has something strange about them. You've got Eddie's constant scheming, Double D's huge brain, and then Ed is Ed. But even the side characters are pretty wacky and weird too. We got Johnny, whose best friend is a piece of wood, Rolf and his old country heritage that just never really makes sense, and then the Cankers, who are just, let's face it, predators. Almost every single moment and character of this show just feels slightly off. I don't think this goes fully into S tier yet, but I think it's the closest we've gotten, so I'm gonna go A. Courage the Cowardly Dog. Let's not even kid here, you already know this one's going towards the top. A show that scarred children for life, being full of weird characters, scary situations, and creepy and unsettling plots and settings. The premise alone is pretty weird. Like, you've got this tiny pink dog who spends his days saving his family from supernatural and evil forces, constantly mixing the world of comedy and horror. You can be laughing at Courage or Eustace at one moment and then just be mentally scarred for life by the most unsettling shit you've ever seen. Just the tonal whiplash alone is enough to categorize this one as weird, but when it did dive into that like uncanny valley, it dove pretty fucking deep. Some of the moments and visuals from this show are just seared into my mind still, and I'm sure some of you too. Courage is peak weird. S tier. Samurai Jack. Probably the most like mature show on our list. Samurai Jack was bold and creative, and it definitely had some hints of weirdness here and there. You know, the whole thing is like a samurai battling against robots and aliens and demons. But honestly, none of it ever felt like too out of place. It's bold and creative in a way that not a lot of the other shows at the time were. And honestly, I think that might have been the weirdest thing about it. The tone of this show always leaned more towards like the seriousness or the melodramatic, rather than being like zany and wacky. And yeah, there's definitely some weird moments here and there that happen, but it always kind of felt more like world building than just like being random to be random. Samurai Jack is a great show, but honestly, I think it's one of the least weird that Cartoon Network has ever made. So we're gonna go D tier. The Cramp Twins. Cramp Twins is a show that I kind of always forget about, but looking back on it, there's definitely some weird shit going on here. It always sort of had like one foot in reality, but that other foot was stepping in something weird. The art style alone had that like mid-2000s grossness to it, just over-the-top faces and lumpy designs that just made it sort of feel a bit unsettling. And then you've got Wayne, one of the main twins, who's just this creepy little goblin f***er. This dude always made me uncomfortable. Like, I don't remember a whole lot about this show, but I remember not fucking liking this guy. I think I'm gonna go with a B tier. Codename Kids Next Door. The premise itself for the show isn't like too out there. Like, yeah, it's a show about kids who are secret agents, but Spy Kids had already happened at this point. And don't even get me started on Agent Cody Banks. The fact that Destination London isn't in the Criterion Collection is a crime against humanity. But that's not the point. I love this show, but it was definitely a bit strange. But it was also so imaginative and creative and fun that it really just sort of outweighed all the weirdness. Like, kid agents, not that weird. Kid agents fighting fully grown adults in costumes, getting a little bit weirder. Kid agents who have a base on the moon invent crazy technology and fight not just adults, but giant hamsters, a pirate who's obsessed with candy, and a vampire who just fucking spanks you. Yeah, it's getting a little weird. This one was like surreal and really out there a lot of the times, but for some reason it didn't feel like too strange when you were watching it. I think just once you sort of like settle into the show, all the weirdness just feels right. None of it is like jarring or off-putting really. I'd say it's definitely a bit stranger than like Powerpuff Girls, which sort of has like the same kids fighting villains vibes. So I'm gonna go a spot above that on B tier. Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. Every single thing about this show is completely insane. The plot alone is crazy from the get-go. Two kids win a limbo contest with the Grim Reaper and now he has to be their best friend. That's wild, but that's just the tip of the iceberg here. Every single plot line, character, moment of this show is just filled with this chaotic and strange, weird energy, and I fucking loved it. Billy's insane, Mandy's the most evil person in the world, the Grim Reaper is Jamaican. What more could you ask for? Constantly towing the line between gross out humor, genuine horror, and just complete absurdity. I'll blend it up together to make something not only unique, but weird as hell. S tier, for sure. Evil Con Carne. Sort of like the forgotten sister show to Grim Adventures. It actually started off as being part of the same show titled Grim and Evil, but I think this one just loses a touch of the weirdness that Grim Adventures had. Like, don't get me wrong, it is weird as fuck. The premise is like this evil crime lord gets his brain and his stomach transferred onto a Russian bear and then tries to take over the world. Like, honestly, it might be the weirdest premise of any of these shows. But I think the fact that it focused more on being like a parody of supervillains really sort of watered the weirdness down on this one. Like, yeah, the settings, the characters, they're all super weird. But I think it just loses like a bit of that unsettling, uneasy feeling you get with shows like Courage or Grim Adventures, with like just that little bit of horror injected in its DNA. It's still weird as hell, but just not quite weird enough to hit the top of the list, so I'm gonna go A tier. Code Lyoko. I used to love this show as a kid, and I feel like anytime I bring it up to anybody, they're like, what was that? And then I show them a picture and they're like, oh, I think I remember that. At first watch, it seems like a pretty normal show. It's like an anime-inspired art style about just a group of kids at a school. Then you find out that they go into this virtual world where they're heroes and save the day. Still not really that weird, but then you get that god-awful early 2000s CGI, and dear lord, this show dives headfirst into the uncanny valley. I firmly believe that if they just stuck with like the 2D animation throughout the whole show, it would probably be remembered pretty fondly. But instead, we got this. And this just did not age well at all. Like, I'm sure the people who made it at the time were like, damn, this looks really cool. But they were wrong. You take that janky CGI out of here, I think this would have been a classic. But that alone makes it just weird enough that it's going to end up somewhere on this list. And I think that somewhere is going to be C tier. Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. A show centered on imaginary friends come to life, living in this big mansion together after their kids abandoned them, should be pretty weird. And while some of the characters looked a little strange and acted a little quirky, that was sort of the point, you know? They're these beings that were made up by children. But outside of like the designs of the characters themselves, the show's fairly normal. It tended to have this like sweet and warm tone to it. Sure, things could get like zany and silly from time to time, but nothing ever really like too nonsensical or crazy. Like, it was definitely a bit on the surreal side, but not like fever dream level. Except for Cheese. If you just watched the episode with Cheese in it, disregard everything I just said. Cheese is insane. But despite the cheese of it all, I think this one's pretty straightforward for the most part. I think I'd put Foster's on C tier. Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi. One of the few cartoons out there that's based on actual people. This show follows fictionalized cartoon versions of the Japanese pop stars who were mostly known for the Teen Titans theme and this cartoon. It was mostly structured as like a band sitcom, but with it being animated, they were able to get pretty surreal and weird with it at times. They had them fighting giant sushi monsters, getting stuck in a haunted castle, and just all sorts of silly shenanigans that you could really only get away with it being a cartoon. The show had lots of visual gags and like fourth wall breaks and some pretty absurd scenarios, but nothing quite too strange and out there. I'd say this one leans more towards like the silly and the zany than the weird and the strange. So I'm going to go with B tier. The Life and Times of Juniper Lee. Now, this one is a real outlier for this channel. Even though it's about a kid with magical powers who has to balance that responsibility with like normal school life, it wasn't really that weird at all. Honestly, this one was so normal feeling that it sort of felt out of place. Like, it tended to feel more of like a Nickelodeon show or like a Disney Channel show. It's basically like Cartoon Network's version of American Dragon Jake Long. Nothing too visually bizarre, pretty consistent tone throughout. If anything, I think this show might have benefited from being a little more weird. So I'm going to go D tier. Camp Lazlo. Quirky, chaotic, and just packed with strange characters and plot lines. It mostly followed the lives of the campers there, with all of whom had their very strange quirks to them. But perhaps the strangest character of all was Scoutmaster Lumpus, who throughout the show was pretty much like a Squidward stand-in, constantly being cranky and annoyed with the campers. But the real icing on the cake is the final episode, where you find out he's just a crazy person that's been impersonating a camp counselor the entire time. Might be the weirdest ending to any of these shows. But even outside of the ending, the whole run of the show is just filled with crazy characters and moments. It did tend to stick to like the camp setting, which sort of reeled it in a little bit. And by the end of most episodes, everything would always like return to normal. But altogether, this one was a pretty weird show. So I'm going to go A tier. My gym partner is a monkey. Monkey, monkey, monkey. This show was just meant to be insane from the get-go. The entirety of it is set in a school for talking animals where the main character is a human boy that accidentally gets transferred there. That setup alone is just ripe for insanity. Besides Adam, the human main character, every other character on the show is basically like half middle schooler, half wild animal, which is sort of like two sides of the same coin. Jake the spider monkey, the titular monkey, is just loud and chaotic and constantly dragging Adam into crazy situations. And honestly, he's one of the more tame characters. Unlike Courage and Billy and Mandy, it wasn't like creepy and unsettling, just pretty consistently silly and a little bit out there. I'd say it's right up there with Laszlo in like the realm of 2000s Cartoon Network just being a little bit unhinged. Not horrifying enough for S tier, but definitely deserving of an A tier. Johnny Test. Johnny Test is sort of like a weird case in that in the moment it feels like you're watching something just completely weird and strange, but looking back on it, it was pretty straightforward most of the time. Sure, you've got a talking dog, scientist twin sisters, and just tons of sci-fi gimmicks going on in basically every episode. But outside of that, there's nothing really too weird going on. None of the characters are really like too weird or creepy or anything. Just sort of like exaggerated sitcom trope characters. Every episode would basically follow the same formula of Johnny wanting something, the sisters making it, and chaos ensuing. I think this one's about the same level of weird as like Dexter's Lab or Powerpuff Girls, so let's say C tier. Ben 10. An absolute classic, and while it's really creative and imaginative in the way that it blends like sci-fi and humor, I don't think this one's really that weird. I think this has more in common with like Samurai Jack than Billy and Mandy. It's a pretty straightforward action show for kids with some hints of weirdness here and there, but nothing really too overt. Most of the weirdness comes from like the aliens and the setting. A little unsettling at times, but not really too bad. I'd say pretty much any and every character from Courage has these guys outmatched in the creepy factor by like tenfold. I think Ben 10 goes on C. Class of 3000. The concept for this one definitely isn't weird at all. You know, it's like a jazz musician who comes back to a school to teach music. Nothing weird at all going on there. But then when you realize that the person who made the show and stars in it is Andre 3000, his influence and creativity definitely drives this a bit more towards the weird side. For the most part, it's a pretty normal show, but every episode tends to have this like musical break where like just nothing is off the table when it comes to how creative and weird they could get with it. It would oftentimes like delve into completely different art styles with just like trippy visuals going on. None of the characters or settings or plots were really too weird, but the experimental styles that you get in the musical numbers definitely help this one branch out into the strange a bit more. But instead of it being like the unsettling sort of weird, it's more of like the creative and inspiring kind of weird. This one was strange, but like in all the right ways. So I'm gonna say B tier. Chowder. Chowder was weird as fuck. Just a great example of a show where every single aspect, from its art style with the backgrounds that never moved, the characters all being completely unhinged in their own crazy ways, the writing of the show just completely leaning into the absurdity of everything, just all sort of coming together to make something truly weird. Everything in the world is like food themed, including all the characters themselves, which isn't really ever explained. Basically, every character is like one step out of the normal too, some of them quite a few steps. And one of like the biggest running gags of the show was how often they would break the fourth wall, sometimes even going to like live action or even the voiceover cast reading the script. The whole tone of the show was just whimsical and weird and pretty much like nonsensical at times. But it just did such a good job of embracing that weirdness that it all turned out great. Just totally silly, wacky, unhinged, and just weird as hell. I'm gonna go S tier. The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack. Flapjack's probably at the top of the list. This show wasn't just weird, it was straight up unsettling at times. The whole thing takes place in like a diseased pirate town, and then you've got Flapjack himself, who's this wide-eyed, naive kid, being paired up with Captain Knuckles, who's this like old, washed-up pirate. The tone of the show is just all over the place. One second it's sweet and silly, and then next it's hitting you with the grossest close-up image you've ever seen. This isn't like fun weird like Chowder, this is... I probably shouldn't have watched this as a kid kind of weird. Definitely one of the network's strangest shows and an easy S tier. Adventure Time. A show with weirdness just absolutely baked into its DNA. The whole thing is whimsical and fantastical while also just having this like looming dread hanging over it. Finn and Jake, the main characters, are pretty much normal but also sort of lunatics. Then outside of them, you've got characters like the Ice King, who is just tragic and insane. And then you've got people like Lumpy Space Princess, who's this floating blob of sass. Honestly, the most well-rounded and grounded characters are probably a princess who's made of bubblegum and a vampire queen with daddy issues. constantly surreal and wacky, with bizarre characters and settings, but also every now and then just delving into complete existential dread. I don't think it's quite as weird and nightmarish as like Flapjack or Courage, but it's pretty damn close. I'm gonna go A tier, regular show. I can assure you, that's not what this is. Each episode starts out fairly normal, with the two main characters facing some like everyday normal task before everything just goes completely off the rails. Filled with tons of like 80s vibes, weird artistic choices, and just truly bizarre scenarios happening from everyday occurrences. The cast of characters are strange themselves. You've got the main characters who are talking animals, and then you've got an abominable snowman, a ghost who loves high fives, a lollipop with a mustache, a tiny green ogre who's constantly taking off his shirt, and a goddamn gumball machine. But compared to some of the scenarios that they find themselves in, they're one of the most normal parts of the show. Instead of being a show that's like drenched in this sort of weirdness, it sort of felt more of like a grounded, realistic show that would just delve into insanity in any second. I love this show. It's probably like a top 5 Cartoon Network show for me, but it's pretty fucking weird. I'm gonna go A tier. Mad. When you're adapting like a comedic magazine filled with parody and satire made for kids, it's gonna get a little weird. Based on the long-running magazine, this was pretty much like Robot Chicken for babies, parodying just like anything and everything, but usually with like a pretty gross layer on top of it at times. This was pretty much like a sketch show for kids with no rules and at times no logic. The art styles would vary depending on which sketch it was, going from like flash animation to 3D models to something that looked like it was made in Microsoft Paint. It was weird and bizarre and just a truly strange show most of the time. I don't think it's quite weird enough to go to S tier, but it's really fucking weird. So we're going A tier. The Amazing World of Gumball. This show had a whole lot of strange energy going on. Every character looks like they were pulled out of like a different cartoon, some being 2D animated, some being 3D, and then some even being like puppets. And this show knew it was weird too, like it was constantly breaking the fourth wall, getting super meta, parodying internet memes, and just going from like slapstick humor to unsettling creepy, constantly warping reality and the laws of physics. It was chaotic, unpredictable, silly, but also really funny. I think this one was like one of the last truly great, weird Cartoon Network shows. But that could be because I'm an adult now. Either way, we're going S tier. And last up, we've got Uncle Grandpa. And there you have it. My list of the strangest and weirdest shows that Cartoon Network has to offer. Do you agree with my rankings? Are there other shows from the channel that you thought should have been included? Let me know. And I'm going to get ahead of this one because it comes up in a lot of my comments, and so I know it's going to here. I haven't watched Total Drama Island. I'm sorry. I watched maybe an episode when it was airing, and I just sort of moved on. I'm sorry I let you down, and I will try to be better for you. Thanks for watching.